In the years since 1980, the incarceration rate has nearly tripled. So it would seem to be a reasonable assumption that violent crime would have also increased during the same time period. Well, crime increases until the early 90s, but since then, violent crime has decreased by half. So why is the prison population so high when there has been less need to lock people up? Let's take a look at another set of data. The US has more people behind bars than any other country, not just per capita, not including probation and parole. The US has more prisoners than Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, even more than Soviet gulags ever imprisoned. Does the US have more criminals than the rest of the world? The answer is probably not. Remember how prison populations spiked in 1980? Well, it's important to examine the two important phenomena at that time. First, let's talk about the war on drugs. Since the 1980s, the prison population has grown largely due to nonviolent convictions. Much of this increase can be traced to the federal government's war on drugs under Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton. The second important event in the early 1980s was the opening of the first private for-profit prison in Tennessee. The government originally made the decision to privatize prisons to save money and increase quality. However, there's little evidence to suggest that private prisons have succeeded at either of these objectives. In fact, in 2016, the Justice Department and the Bureau of Prisons under the Obama administration decided to phase out use of private prisons, citing the fact that they did not save costs and came with safety and security problems. However, reversing that order was one of the first things Jeff Sessions, Trump's Attorney General, did when he took office. There's an obvious problem with for-profit prisons. The goal of the criminal justice system should be to deter crime and detain and rehabilitate those who break the law. However, a corporation that profits from a higher number of incarcerated individuals has an incentive to imprison more people. This is counter to the public goal of rehabilitation and decreasing recidivism, or rates of criminals who reoffend. So let's circle back to our earlier questions. Why, if violent crime is declining, is prison population soaring? That's where the prison industrial complex comes in. The prison industrial complex consists of private prisons who seek, through lobbying and other methods, to increase their own profit by incarcerating more people, particularly those that belong to marginalized groups. Let's break that down, because it's a pretty loaded statement. First, let's examine the lobbying and other methods that private prison corporations use to increase prison populations, which increases their profit. Private prison companies lobby to run prisons, and the government signs contracts agreeing that the prisons have to contain at least 1,000 beds and maintain 90% occupancy rates. These contracts create incentives to increase incarceration for minor, nonviolent offenses, which private prisons thrive on. In addition, private prison companies lobby for 3-strike laws and minimum sentencing rules, fight against early releases for good behavior, and seek to criminalize immigration and marijuana to increase their occupancy rates. So, we know that the prison population is increasing due to nonviolent offenses. The proportion of nonviolent offenders was about half in 1980. In 1995, it was less than a third. This is important for examining the second part of our original statement. How do private prisons further the oppression of marginalized groups? First, let's take a look at how the prison system treats the poor, homeless, and mentally ill. I bet you didn't know that 70% of U.S. prison inmates are illiterate. By comparison, 14% of the U.S. population as a whole is illiterate. About 200,000 or 10% of prison inmates suffer from debilitating mental illness, and 60 to 80% of the inmate population has a history of substance abuse. This points out a glaring flaw with the U.S. criminal justice system. There are much better alternatives for people who cannot read, have mental illness, or have a history of substance abuse: rehabilitation. Their nonviolent offenses could be corrected with education, community service, or drug treatment. Unfortunately, the number of drug treatment slots in prisons has declined by more than half, and educational programs are going the same way. Now let's talk about another marginalized group that is especially impacted by the prison population: Black men. About half the inmates in the U.S. are Black, compared to only 12% of the total population. At this moment, 1 in every 14 Black men is in prison or jail. In addition, 1 in 4 Black men will be imprisoned at some point in his life. Remember the war on drugs I mentioned earlier? Well, with these statistics in mind, it becomes painfully clear that the war on drugs is more of a war on Blackness. Keep in mind that illegal drug use is the same among white and Black men, but Black men are 5 times more likely to be arrested for a drug offense. Black people are the real victims of the prison industrial complex. There are more black men in prison, on probation, or on parole than there were enslaved in 1850. There's a reason they're calling mass incarceration the new Jim Crow. Black men are now being oppressed and discriminated through the criminal justice system. Another victim of the prison industrial complex is undocumented immigrants. Immigration is one of the most heated political debates, especially as there are more than 12,000 unaccompanied children in U.S. detention centers. The Trump administration has worked to enforce harsh border control, and this benefits Trump campaign donors like CoreCivic and GEO Group, the two largest private prison corporations in the country. These private prison corporations spend millions on campaigns and lobbying against immigration reform and signs lucrative deals with ICE and the federal government. The Trump administration leaves no doubt that it will detain as many undocumented immigrants as it can and house them in private prisons. Private prisons house about 73% of immigrant detainees and make a huge profit off detaining these innocent people. We've talked a lot about the macro-level economic problems with private prisons and the prison industrial complex, but let's think about how the system is affecting all of these people as individuals. It's much harder to get access to education, housing, loans, and jobs with a criminal record. People with criminal records, especially those who already belong to marginalized groups, are facing even more severe disadvantages in all life outcomes because of nonviolent offenses. No matter how you look at it, private prisons go against public good. Private prisons have an incentive to increase their population regardless of need and have no desire to rehabilitate prisoners so that they won't reoffend. They are not actually making society safer or even saving the taxpayer any money, despite rhetoric that preys on our fear of crime. Returning to our original question, why does the U.S. have 5% of the world's population and yet 25% of its prisoners? And we see that the answer grows more complex the more we examine it. It's a complicated, hidden web of racism, xenophobia, and extreme class discrimination, fueled by exploitative and lucrative industry profits. Thanks so much for listening.